It is start time, friends. Let's go. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kay McClinney. It's a pleasure to welcome over 400 participants to this webinar offered by NCII, the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement. Thank you for joining this important discussion of leadership for equity in community colleges. The session actually was inspired by responses to two issues in a series of equity discussion guides that were developed by NCII and authored by a distinguished collection of leaders, nearly all of them leaders of color from across the country. The discussion guides, by the way, and an institutional self-assessment instrument are available on the NCII website. So to today's topic, as I wrote in the introduction to the two perspectives on leadership for equity, under any set of circumstances, leading an institution in work to attain equity and eliminate institutional racism is a task that is simply fraught with challenges. Those challenges clearly are both illuminated and exacerbated in an environment where we have intensified calls for racial justice, and they are understandably raised at this time, and they are raised in the midst of a global pandemic. Furthermore, one of the lessons of my own work, and many of yours, I'm guessing, is that over decades of listening to and working with people in community college, the leadership challenges are just different for leaders of color than for those leaders who are white. Leaders of color report hearing the criticism that they care only about their people, or that they are angry or embittered, while at the same time their own people may criticizing them for doing too little, or even crossing over to the other side. So on the other hand, white leaders have their own share of criticisms, and those may include that they do not or cannot fully recognize the pervasiveness of racism and their own unconscious bias, that they may attend too little or too much to inequities and outright racism embodied in institutional systems and policies and practices, or that they have somehow appropriated the equity agenda from its rightful advocates. So how can leaders lead in this context? NCII asked for perspectives on that question from two esteemed colleagues who are community college presidents with us here today. Dr. Michael Baston, president of the Rockland Community College, which is part of the State University of New York system, and Dr. Bill Scroggins, president of Mount San Antonio College in California. To hear from those leaders, we will now go to a discussion moderated by yet another esteemed colleague and dear friend, Dr. Linda Garcia, Executive Director of the Center for Community College Student Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin. There will be time at the end of the discussion for questions from participants, so we encourage you, please submit your questions via the chat box throughout the conversation so that we can respond at the end. And now to Linda.
Kay, thank you for the great introduction. I am so honored just to moderate this conversation. Just to let the participants know, we're going to go on a journey. We're going to ask questions to these two wonderful community college leaders. Ask them about their personal experiences, about the inequities they've experienced or they've witnessed, how that has impacted who they are, their leadership, and then eventually how they're using that experience knowledge to lead their own community colleges. So let's start with the first question. Going back to the discussion guides that Kay mentioned, in those discussion guides, Bill and Michael, the ones that you both wrote, you shared your personal experiences on the inequities that impacted who you are. Now, Michael, you described it as a lived experience. And let me just quote you here from the guide, you stated that it's important to know yourself and others' perceptions of you. You must establish yourself as worthy to be followed because you listen, not just speak. And Bill, your experience is different. You describe it as a conversion experience. And let me just quote what you said in your guide. You said, what had come easy to you, to me, as you said, was that there was a continuing struggle for those who were not white. The inequity struck a chord in me, which was you. So tell us more about that. And let's start with Michael.
Well, certainly I'm glad to be here today. And Linda, thank you so much for sort of leading us through this conversation and journey. When I think of my own role at my college and sort of in this work, I see myself as a freedom fighter. You know, I see myself as one who is engaged in this responsibility to establish opportunities for people to live the lives that they deserve. It's not a new thing for me. That's part of my whole life story. You know, before I was in higher education in the community college space, I was a lawyer, a public interest lawyer, fighting against sort of landlords who were mistreating people, fighting against the systematic racism of segregation in the 90s, not in the 60s, 50s, in the 90s, to desegregate school systems in Florida, to try to bankrupt those organizations, white supremacy organizations that were burning churches in the South, and tried to kind of use the hate crimes laws to address those areas. So for me, this has been a very personal journey in terms of being a freedom fighter, believing in life, liberty, and pursuit of justice for everyone, and understanding that the community college specifically is democracy's college, is America's college. We have the ability to open the doors of opportunity for all. That being said, in my own journey, you know, I came into it, I had a doctorate, I have a JD, but I had to go back and get a doctorate in education because that was the expectation if I was going to ascend to different opportunities within this community. So it's almost like regardless of what you attain and what you fight for in a noble way, you have to still continue to recognize as a person of color that at the end of the day, there's so many different ways that you have to go through the process of vetting to make folks feel comfortable that you understand how things work here and that you will actually effectively navigate the here. And so you bring all of that into your experience as you think about how your institution impacts other people as well.
Bill, what about you?
So I grew up in suburban Los Angeles, the only son of two parents, neither of whom had gone to college. But I never doubted that I would go to college. I was in an honors program in high school and went into UCLA. And I had never experienced anything except the protected environment of that suburban household. What I found at UCLA in the 1960s was a culture in revolt, and I didn't understand what was going on. But over that period of time, I had friends and colleagues who shared experiences that I realized that the students around me, particularly those of color, did not have the same opportunities that I had. And that wasn't right to me. So although I was pursuing a career in chemistry, I changed direction to become a teacher because I wanted to help others. And as I matured as a leader, I always looked for opportunities to break down the system rules that showed to me to inhibit the ability of my students to achieve their full educational potentials. I had no tools, I had no training to do that. It was sort of an on-the-job training, but it was really a conversion of my own thoughts as a person and a leader to become a crusader to do this. And as I moved in from being a faculty leader, I was president of the State Academic Senate, in which I had many opportunities to initiate changes. I added my to my skills, the ability to work with a broad range of people, and sort of blind passion, but passion nevertheless. And as I described in the document that I wrote, when I became a college president, I saw that there was institutional practices that I had thought were equitable, but I discovered that equity doesn't equal equal. That isn't being equal isn't equitable. And so what I had thought was, if you just provide the same opportunities to people of color that the main population had, that would be enough. But that conversion was, it's not enough. I'm a scientist, I looked at the data, I talked to colleagues, and I began to look at ways to change the institution, to challenge the institutional perspectives that equal was enough. So those challenges, those experiments led me to change my worldview and to change my leadership to one of looking at demographics and disproportionate impact, to looking at what each person needed to be successful. So our college definition of equity is to provide each student with the support and resources that they need to achieve their full educational potential. And that was a real conversion in my leadership to that equity that hit me in the face as a 17-year-old at UCLA.
Bill, thanks for sharing that. And just on the same thread of you speaking about challenges, that brings me to my next question about leading for anti-racism and equity. So it's hard, no matter who the person is, or no matter how the person looks, brown, white, yellow, it doesn't matter. But in this case, you know, it's a different kind of hard for you, Michael, being a Black CEO, a president at Rockland Community College. It's a different kind of hard, Bill, for you as a white CEO president at Mount San Antonio College of California. Tell me about those challenges. How do you bring people on? Tell me some examples. Bill, let's start with you.
So I'm now at a point of trying to dig deeper into these issues that you're just talking about, the racism. And so with the death of George Floyd, the whole campus was turned into turmoil. We had an all-staff meeting, a Zoom meeting, and you know, I've got 120 managers, and I was to lead that discussion. We had a business agenda, but I decided I'm going to throw that out, and I'm going to tell how I feel about this. And many of you know me. I'm a scientist, I'm a chemist, I'm an analytical guy. So, and I've run the college that way. But it's not what was needed. I needed to tell people how much that hurt after all the work I'd done throughout my career, this discovery pattern that I was on, all of that. And I lived through the civil rights eras, and I saw those battles, and what I was very disappointed was the country was going in the wrong direction. So I shared that. I said, we're going to put the business aside. And I talked about how I felt about this, how the pain, and it was a balance between anger and disappointment. And I shared the anger of a career in education, of helping people, and the world falling apart, and all that work over 40 years, not getting through to people that this education was supposed to be the path to the American dream, and it wasn't happening. I was angry about it. And then I was disappointed to say, really, the country with the greatest opportunity to make a change in the world, and we're the bad example for the world. I was so disappointed. And so I just let that all spill out. The meeting was scheduled for an hour and a half. We went 2.5 hours, and people began to talk. I have an African-American vice president of human resources. He said something to me that I'll never forget. I grew up living in a cage. And he talked about the bars are always around me. And I've been successful by a lot of means, but all that's done is that the iron cage has turned to a golden cage. This lives with me every day. And I can't relate to that on a personal level the way he does. But believe me, just sharing my story and my emotions will open the door to many people sharing, and it's changed my leadership to lead by being personally validating how I feel and supporting the energy in this direction to do something about it, to have a call to action.
Bill, thank you. Michael, let's hear from you.
I mean, that is such a powerful sort of response, and one that resonates with me in so many ways. But it is interesting that for many Black CEOs like myself, our ability to communicate that exact same message could be mistaken in so many different ways by folks that actually hear it. So some will actually say, well, you are the angry Black man, and you know, folks, if they just, I didn't do it, so why should I have to deal with the structural racism? And I it's not my fault. This is about reparations. I shouldn't have to. And so there's so many different things that go through so many folks' minds about sort of what the appropriate response is, and when it comes to, quite frankly, CEOs of color, we're not often afforded the opportunity to have that same level of expression, because we have to deal with all of the hidden conversations that happen in the communities where we serve that we're not in. And so we have to be measured often. We have to sort of kick in our emotional intelligence and find more strategic ways to address these very conflicting and difficult issues. Many people in communities, even in my state, now we're a quote unquote blue state, but even in my state, people feel like that this is something that happens somewhere else. They don't think that they have race issues. There's no race issues in New York. This is, we're not there. That stuff is old stuff. We got to move on past it. Can't we just all get along? That sort of thing. But when you actually take the perspective of, like, we've got to really look at some things here, it is sort of freeing. What I find from some of my colleagues, my white colleagues, when I talk to them, it's freeing for them to talk about it. And it's a set of sort of conversations that we as CEOs of color have to embrace in different ways, given the context of where we are. When I was at LaGuardia Community College, if I talked about racial justice and equity and social justice, that wouldn't offend anybody. Everybody like, yes, absolutely. But when you're in other parts of the country and you are the first Black president or the only Black major leader in the community in which you are, everything you say is parsed and measured and examined and looked at, and so from my perspective, what I found to be the better strategy for me, of course, I shared how I felt and I put it out there, and the role of education in a moment like this. But I also elevated the voices of our students. So we had a student panel that I had the opportunity to facilitate. So it's not just, here's the angry Black president that really is outraged by the killing of George Floyd. Here are students that said that they went through their whole educational experience at the institution and never had a Black professor. Here's students that say maybe there's only 2 classes out of maybe the 1,000 courses we offer. Here's the only 2 that have any kind of connectivity to racial issues or to any kind of lifting from a heritage perspective, and so then I lifted the voices of employees. We had a forum where we let the employees, the Black employees, give their perspective. And I've had some that have been there 20, 30 years and said, we have never had an opportunity to have a set aside time where the college listened to the voice of our Black employees in this way. At the same time, it was a stretch to get 6 people to be on that panel, because there were a lot of Black employees that said, no, I don't want to say nothing because I don't want my fellow colleagues to look at me any kind of way. I don't want to actually I have some feelings in my heart, but I want to keep it to myself. So understand that the conversation of race is a difficult conversation, and it is a challenging conversation, and it is in fact a courageous conversation. And the idea that, everybody's very comfortable with diversity. But people are not necessarily comfortable with equity, because you're actually saying, here are the numbers. Here's what happens. I specifically know Black leaders who were at my college before I got here, who left because they had not a good experience as a Black executive leader at the college. And it is what they went through there over time, over the years, that now have put me in a place where I can be in an institution and I can say personally, I have not experienced what some who came through Rockland experienced now. But I can say that my folks are awoke. My folks are now getting involved and saying, I had faculty members specifically say, hey, listen, I'm an English professor and I could diversify the readings that my students have. I had another professor, we could do performing arts activities where we elevate the voices of Black students, because it's not that we don't want to do it. We just didn't have that level of consciousness until we heard from our colleagues, till we heard from our students. And understanding that as the president, you're not coming in with a hammer to make everybody now all of a sudden be any particular way, but you're creating an environment where dialogue can move the discussion, that you're going to then examine data in a real way so that you can be honest about it, to know what we are talking about. Because we often don't have these conversations, or we want to limit these conversations to disaggregating data around students. So that way you don't have to think about, the fact that you don't have a diverse faculty, you don't have a diverse staff. There are not opportunities for movement throughout the institution so that it is truly reflective of the community that you serve.
So this is a follow-up question. So Michael, how do you bring the community into this conversation when maybe they're not used to having that? And especially with a CEO of color, like you said, you have to maybe choose your moments. But we always want people to be brave and to always take that step. But if you're kind of doubting or thinking or contemplating, how do you bring these people into this conversation, considering a person who has experienced these maybe inequities or have been in this situation or challenges? How do you bring those folks into the conversation without maybe if you're walking on eggshells, maybe feeling like that? How do you handle all that?
Well, I think part of the strategy that we used was to say, well, what is the framework that we're operating in? And we, in our campus, chose to operate within the Guided Pathways framework. So it gave us a really good sort of framework, most specifically the Lost Momentum framework from Completion by Design, because now we use that in Guided Pathways. It allows us to use it as a template for addressing equity issues, as you'll see in the guides that we have through this Equity Guides series. It allows us to say, hey, we can use metrics not only for the student experience, you could also use metrics in the employee experience, because connection, entry, progress, and completion actually can fit in nicely with any way to have meaningful dialogues. The other thing is you've got to engage people in sort of meaningful collaborations. One of the greatest things that we did, I think, at Rockland with our work around Guided Pathways is that it was a bottom-up experience, and it was an integrated experience, and it was an experience from folks throughout all levels. So we want to replicate that good work, because it actually has created that momentum for us of collaboration, so that we're building that culture of collaboration that will help us become what we want to be, which is a more inclusively excellent institution. What can you argue with? The inclusion or the excellence? So, but the opportunity to finally have these kinds of conversations. There are some of my white faculty and staff members that have said to me, I never knew that my Black colleagues felt that way. They didn't, because there was never a reason for us to have those kind of conversations. Taco Tuesday is not diversity.
Right.
Having an event for Black History Month and the Spanish Month, and we're going to have St. Patrick's Day and Columbus Day. Like, just because we have those cultural activities, that's not true diversity, inclusion, and equity work, that is an element of creating an inclusive community. So I think we've got to be thinking very deeply. And we, at our campus, we have been very, very transparent. We have lifted and elevated voices. And as the president, you know, you do have to create an environment. Honestly, I could not have started my work at Rockland with equity. We couldn't start it with that because we had to get things in order to move it forward as an institution. We had to kind of, you know, take off. But because we did that work of building the culture of collaboration, now our work in equity can move forward and can advance our institution. So you have to, you know, that this is where in my art, my guide, I talk about, you know, emotional intelligence. It is understanding, you know, how you perceive yourself, how others perceive you, by really recognizing that you can't just be doing talking, you have to listen. I've done a lot of listening. And when I have been wrong on an issue, we had to hit the reset button on something, I was very open and honest about that because that's how you build trust.
Mm-hmm. Michael, that's great. So Bill, with trust, as you were going through this journey, as a follow-up question to the second question, you know, how did you build trust in this conversation of equity with your faculty and your staff?
So actions speak louder than words. And one of the things that in listening to Michael, I can emphasize these initiatives. So when I started a Dream Center several years ago, the first one in California, I didn't get that pushback. Oh, you know, he's just self-interested in that. And I was able to listen to people on campus and in the community about what the issues were, and being able to, for example, bring legal services in, which is outside the realm of what the colleges are supposed to do. But I did it because of the right thing, and I listened to people and worked with community leaders to guide me. I don't know how to do this, but what I can do is go with my instinct of what the right thing is to do and look for people to do it. And frankly, Michael, I don't get challenges the same way you're talking about when I do these things. I started a Pride Center on campus, and I took a full-time faculty member who really is passionate and talented, and assigned that person to do this. And we recently expanded the facilities, and I ordered the expansion of facilities. And we changed, for example, the pronouns and allowed students to, on their roster, have the name that they have. And I sent out emails to the whole campus saying that this is what we're doing and it's the right thing to do. So that I listened to people, and because I know that I don't know the specifics of how to do it. But what I can do is support the things that are those kind of initiatives and look for things that connect to the community, connect to the Pride community, and have that support from the community. The same with the Dream Center. When the president tried to withdraw the DACA opportunity for students who are immigrants as children, I talked to my board of trustees, who are not liking a lot of this stuff, and said, we're going to have, before a board meeting, we're going to have a community meeting with students and community people. They're going to talk to you about why this presidential resolution. And I wrote with a lot of help from the people that I listened to, a presidential resolution with things in it like, if an ICE agent comes on campus, I'd already talked to lawyers about this, we can throw them off campus. I have 3 days to do that, to say we're not going to follow your subpoena, and put those things in writing. And I knew my board was going to have a problem with it, but after they heard from the students and the community, they went along with it. So I think that listening to people who have the strategy and expertise, supporting those, using my bully pulpit and my authority, frankly, to open those doors and show people that these really work. And afterwards, everyone says, we're really proud we have the best Dream Center in the world. We're really seeing how it helps our LGBTQ students be empowered in our classrooms. You act rather than speaking first. You act, and then when the words are necessary, when that emails need to go out, they already see some of that work's doing, and they see that it has my imprimatur. And I have to say that while it's been challenging, I get some of those evil emails back. Nevertheless, the support that the actions generate in speaking loud help the message be authentic, even though I'm not sure as a white CEO, I can authentically speak about those issues. By having that assistance, I feel confident that the direction we're going is got this, the support of the community I'm trying to serve. You know, this white liberalism where you think you know what's best for other people is so abhorrent to me. And I see a lot of that. As a white CEO, you have to listen to the people who know where to go. And I think that's what makes the difference. That's what builds the trust.
And I love what Bill said, because the idea of getting the supportive community, you know, is essential. I am so grateful to our board of trustees, because they have been bold. You know, they're passing a resolution that really speaks to supporting the work of really, and saying, you know, in their resolution that says we will work alongside the faculty, the staff, and the students as we seek to become a more an equitably inclusive and an equitably excellent and inclusive excellent institution. Like, I love that, you know, the fact that we're working directly with our county commission for human rights to sort of be the educational partner for the Commission of Human Rights in our county is very powerful, because what you're saying is that word community in your title really truly means something, that you're actually creating sort of this environment where we all say it's not white versus black, it's everyone versus racism. And this is sort of, you know, the more we understand that this is everybody's responsibility and that everybody has to understand what we're talking about in terms of implicit bias, and how that implicit bias is driven by the kind of outcomes that were produced by laws in this country. You know, it is the laws that created the outcomes that have led to these bad narratives. And we as a country, even though the laws have changed, we have not changed every man's and every woman's heart on these issues. And so that's why I'm inspired and I'm encouraged about what we see in the country today with our young people who are of all races, all ages, all backgrounds, all experiences, all those who are standing up and saying we have to fight all isms and all phobias. And this is the moment to say that we are going to collectively stand up to the things that divide us as we build bridges to each other.
So the world has shifted since both of you wrote those documents, those discussion guides. So let's take a moment just to pause there. Now, this pandemic, it has amplified, it has exposed more of these inequities. You know, there's racial unrest, there is critical health challenges, there's even economic uncertainty going on. Now, some of those challenges we know are not new to some folks, regardless of your background, who you are. But when these conversations occur, we do hear from people, okay, this is another cycle. We go through this, we've heard it, but there's no action. And people rally behind it for a short time, and we got to get things done really, really quick while it's a hot topic, and then it dies down. So in consideration of that, I want you to think about your faculty and your staff and your community, and especially your mid-level leaders. You know, how would you invite them into that conversation? And I'm so glad that both of you talked about it's important to listen. But even though you are listening and active listening, there are some folks, especially mid-level folks, supervisors, directors, or they are still fearful. How do you encourage them? How do you bring them on so they feel like they're not going to be reprimanded for saying something? So tell us about that. So Michael, let's start with you.
Sure. I think it goes back to sort of the importance of the institutional leadership from the governance on down, from the boards on down. You know, if we are saying that this is an institutional imperative to improve sort of the college's ability to be much more equitable and much more direct, then actually it has to be concretized. You know, it has to show up in presidential goals. It has to show up in strategic plans. It has to show up in value statements. You may need to refresh your mission statement if you're really committed to it, because that's what your regional accreditors are going to hold you to. That's what the folks who are going to be coming to your institution have as an expectation. So you've got to, you know, in real ways, concretize the work so that it won't just, when the channel is changed, when our attention shifts to something else, that this won't then be lost before it actually takes root. As a Black CEO, sometimes I do feel like, you know, well, I got to rush and get this done now, because otherwise it'll be something else that'll come and we'll have to be focusing on that and we'll lose sight of this. At my institution, what we've tried to do is really not focus on 50,000 things, but usually focus on one or two things. And we focused on system change so that it is now the new way of doing business versus it being an initiative. We don't need an equity initiative. We need equity embedded in the strategic planning process, in the review of processes, procedures, and the ways in which we operate business. When we created our 5-school model, guess what? We now have 5 deans. Guess what? Those 5 deans will be developing equity scorecards per school. So we actually have someone who's accountable and someone who has responsibility and who will have resources to actually improve hiring practices, improve student outcomes by cohorts, improve things. But if you don't make folks accountable, because this is a part of who we are and who we're becoming, then when the channel gets changed, you don't really have a way to turn it back. You know, we don't want this to be sort of a retrospective many years from now. Oh, remember when we did that thing where we helped those students that one time when it was an issue of something that happened? You know, the fact is, George Floyd was not the first time we heard, I can't breathe. You know, I'm from New York and I'm from New York City. So I can tell you that's not the first time we heard, I can't breathe. The thing that's different about this time is that because America is on pause because of the coronavirus, your consciousness can't be, the channel can't be changed right back to your own economic personal interests. You're not chasing the dollar or you're on your hamster wheel trying to make ends meet. You actually had a moment where we're all sitting at home and we're all watching this and we're drawn into our consciousness being provoked about this kind of situation. My hope is that once we do start to reopen and we do start to have a chance to go back into our various campuses and things like that, that the channel doesn't get changed. And that's why we have to make sure that we are truly intentional about going beyond sort of nice statements in the moment to specific procedural and structural things that need to change in our institutions and metrics that we're going to measure that which we believe is important.
Michael, that's great. Bill, what about you?
So this isn't something that happens overnight. This is my 10th year at the college, and working with the management team has been an important part of that. But it's an overall philosophy is, as a CEO, you're not effective when you do things to people. You're effective when you do things with people.
Absolutely.
And I inherited a management team that were used to having things told to them. And this was a tough one to break out because the senior management had met in a closeted room and never told what was happening. First thing I did is I write the notes of each week's meeting and send it out to everyone with all of the documents on it. They thought I was crazy to start with. We formed a management support team, and they've been given professional development. Now they develop their own professional development, and we've had wonderful things to talk, brought in great facilitators. And my vice presidents at first said, well, we don't have to go to that, do we? I said, yes. And so I went in and was one of the participants. Yes, some of the senior managers were uncomfortable about that. But until you're there working with people, not doing it to them, you don't build a culture where the management team can face the challenging pieces. Right now, we're going to change our faculty hiring process, which has, you were talking, Michael, about those institutional biases. Well, nothing worse than the hiring process. We had minimum qualifications, but then when we looked at what the committees were doing, they were saying, oh, well, yeah, the minimum is maybe a master's degree, but I'm going to give more points to somebody with a doctorate. What you were talking about, Michael, is that doctorate has not implicit, but explicit bias in it. So that if you favor somebody with a doctorate, you're buying somebody else's bias as your own. Now we're going to have an HR review of minimum qualifications, and I've got the faculty union and the faculty senate on board with this, and the middle managers. We're going to do a blind review so that paper review doesn't build in those implicit biases. And this is part of this digging deeper. We changed our recruiting process. We went all over the United States. We changed our application. For 47 faculty tenured position, I had 166 African-American applications. You know how many got out of paper screening in an interview? 0. And so that was the hallmark to me that there's implicit bias. So we're changing it. And the managers have to be on board with that, because I can't be on every selection committee. I have to trust the managers to do this, and they're on board with this. So it begins with establishing trust through working with people instead of acting on them, so that when the challenging initiatives like this change in the hiring practice occur, they have the trust and the relationships, and I trust them through our equity mindedness training to be on board with this. And this isn't the only thing that we're changing. I'm going to announce this week a presidential initiative for both Latinx and African American students and community that's going to address advocacy, it's going to address celebrating who people are, and it's going to address integrated curriculum and have what I have the backing of the faculty to have a graduation requirement. But again, this is a team effort, and I'm going to the managers first about guidance. Remember, I'm going to listen to what our African-American managers and our Hispanic managers have to do about this. And I know that they're going to tell me, I hear you, Michael, that unless you create a safe environment, I'm not going to hear what I need to hear. Listening isn't enough until you create a safe environment where people are going to talk to you authentically. And that was that many years of investment, so that I know that those men and women are going to talk to me honestly, and they know that I'm going to follow through.
So true.
So on that same thread, a follow-up question. So both of you talked about creating environments for your community, your campus community, to come and have these conversations. So we have over 300 participants seeing this conversation right now. What if one of these folks, they're not in that environment? What would you recommend to that person? They can't find themselves in those conversations, but how would you recommend that person maybe help contribute to create an environment where there's conversations like that occurring? What would you say?
What I find very interesting is in our specific context, we don't have a lot of affinity groups. Like, I speak at a lot of different industries, and they're affinity groups. So I've been asked to speak at the construction group. The different groups have these affinity groups, and this is one of the few areas where there are no real affinity groups where people can sit and have these kinds of important dialogues. And so what I would encourage to that person, you don't need a title to be a leader. You really just need good relationships. You really need to be able to talk about what you're trying to accomplish, what's going to be your outcomes, how are things going to get improved if I come and sit and talk with you. So I think that we need to start to kind of think about, well, how do we create these important dialogues? How do we create, where you sit is where you stand. And so you have to be able to feel comfortable in engaging at the level of your comfort until you can get better. You know, I don't think that anybody has to be sort of an expert in sort of addressing all of the possible issues of equity, inclusion, diversity. That's not the point. But get in where you fit in, so to speak. There is a place where people can engage in conversations, and sometimes you're the person that has to start those conversations. And I get the concern about the potential of backlash. I get the concern about the potential of retaliation, but that's why we do have laws in this country that protect us against those things. You know, and I spent my time, as I mentioned earlier on, as an attorney and did equal employment opportunity law. So I understand that many of us are in public institutions, your speech is going to be protected. I think that you have to find ways to sort of get in where you fit in. And for those folks that don't have, at your campus, there's nobody having these conversations, take this video, have a watch party, listen to what we're talking about, go on to the NCII website, get these discussion guides and host informal discussions about the guides. There are ways that we can sort of find our way into the conversation. When those faculty members reached out to me after the student panel, I didn't write an email to everybody and say, well, tell me what you think. Folks started to write in. Wonderful people, fantastic faculty members who said, we can contribute to the conversation. I had 2 faculty members that ran a workshop within like a week of the student panel on teaching equitably and inclusively in a virtual environment for their colleagues, And so I think that, we've got to create the opportunities. All that says, hey, can we do this? I was, of course, let's do it. So you as the leader have to create an environment where this can happen. But ultimately, I think from a leadership perspective, the more we create these opportunities to collaborate at multiple levels, the more we contribute to distributed leadership where everybody's voice matters, the more we have these opportunities, we can then kind of come together. We're not going to agree on everything. We're not going to agree on every solution. But what we can do is at least understand how we can get better and get the training, the support, and the facilitation to get better.
Yeah. Michael, that's good. But let me do a follow-up question with you, because you talk about digging in deep. So the challenge of unconscious bias is that it's just unconscious. So what have been some effective strategies for helping people to dig in deep and just examine the beliefs and behaviors of others' experiences with the racial unjust? How do you go about doing that?
So I think there's not just one way of doing that. I think there has to be an overall change in the campus climate to be willing to look at what the college is doing. And so when I started on this digging deeper, I have the opportunity with our convocation days to have all of the faculty and most of the management team participate in this day of training. And I worked with the faculty to bring in some disruptive opportunities. We have a readers theater, and there was a group of Black students who wanted to do a readers theater based on the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which allows indentured servitude, which has been one of the reasons that so many Black men are in prison. So these Black men erected a prison on the stage and read from Black writers about this issue of the imprisonment of Blacks and what it meant for the true meaning of the Constitution. This was very disruptive. I brought in a woman who is a neuroscientist and also trains judges on how to avoid bias. And she had some group opportunities showing pictures of stereotypical circumstances, and then having the audience clap about which one they reacted more positively to, just intuitively. You could hear the bias in the room, the Western European white stereotypes getting the positive reaction. So that woke people up, but that's not enough. You have to do more than that. So we began to change the way we looked at data. We were disaggregating data and not looking at the next step, having focus groups of students to tell us why that existed, and then have students talk about that and write about that. So the voice of students and using data properly is a good step forward. But I think ultimately the ability to have the other leaders on campus be part of your team. You can't carry this ball yourself. And so one of the things we do as CEOs is we help develop that leadership among the faculty, among the staff, among the trustees, to be able to be part of the voice, so that when you put these initiatives together. So you heard me say that I have this academic senate and the faculty union on board with the change in this process. So those leaders are not there by accident. I work with them as the president to help them in their journey to be able to express their voices. I give them the front row in those speeches in front of the entire faculty, so that it's their voice as well. That type of approach really gives me the opportunity to have this, not some, like Michael was saying, some little initiative off to the side somewhere. These are the institutional leaders that they've chosen, talking to them about the changes that are needed and exposing these outcomes by looking deeper. I could have just written off those 166, but no, we went in there and took a look and proved that it was the historic bias that we were buying into that woke people up. So there's no one way of doing it, and it isn't an easy task. It doesn't occur overnight, but you've got to be both bold and strategic to make it happen.
Michael, I see you nodding your head.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I was so impressed by one of my faculty members who said, when she was talking in one of her programs for faculty, and she said, I didn't really realize that I was engaging in microaggressions in my class. I didn't realize that I had implicit bias. I didn't understand because, I just made a certain set of presumptions. I mean, just think about the impact of this COVID scenario. Some faculty members might have said, well, I want to see the person, make sure that it's them, so they got to turn on their camera, and they have to be on during the time that I do my class because, that's when I do my class, not recognizing that some of the families, that they may only have one computer and mom has to use it and dad has to use it, brothers and sisters have to use it. They didn't recognize that maybe some are a little self-conscious about their living situation and not really comfortable with sharing the light. Maybe, we have to be mindful that, in fact, this pandemic really is highlighting the fact that a lot of people don't necessarily have all the resources that you would normally assume that they should have because you have. And I think that, one of the things that we have to be very mindful of in this whole scenario is that all of us have to get better. All of us have to think about how we can improve the experience of students. And all of us have to look at, when you look around, do you have any colleagues of color in your area? Maybe you never thought about that before, but maybe now is the time to think about that, because we have academic programs, and not just at Rockland, but all over the country. You have academic programs where students will never see a faculty member of color. In their entire academic program, they could actually go through their academic program and never have a faculty member of color. Isn't there something wrong with that when 52% of your student population are students of color? You know, so I think that you have to think about, this is not something that is unique to, so I say this to everyone watching, it's not unique to your institution. You're not sort of the question mark institution. Every institution for the last 60, 70 years have been in this sort of scenario in various ways. If it wasn't racial issues, it was gender issues, and there are so many. So when we think about equity, that's not just limited to the fact that we're having conversations along racial lines. We also still have some gender issues that we are wrestling with and struggling through. I had one during one of our student panels where one of the students said, it would have really been nice if I had seen a woman in one of my classes to let me know, she transferred to Johns Hopkins when she finished with it. But it would have been great if I had one woman in the series of classes I had as I was making my way through the college experience. Well, that's not just my college, that's every college. We all have to take a look at how we're doing in all these areas. And now, what better time than now? I think those 8 minutes and 46 seconds that opened our eyes to the fact that there's some things here that can't continue, I think that has to be something that stays in all of our minds as we move forward.
Michael, you just reminded me of a conversation that I had with an instructor who had told me on the onset of COVID, we were transitioning everything online. I wasn't really thinking about the resources that were not available to the students. She said, in fact, when we were doing Zoom sessions, I always got after my students because I wanted to see their faces, and someone had shown me their faces on Zoom. But then she said I had an aha moment. That aha moment was that it's because the student is probably doesn't have a space, is maybe in their closet or doesn't want to show their background. She says, I was very insensitive to that, but that was a huge learning moment for me. So what you were saying just reminded me of that. So let's take back our conversation to guided pathways. Both of you mentioned that. Guided pathways is really about redesigning the whole institutional experience and the way we work with our students when they enter, they stay on the path, continue on the path, ensure that they're learning. With that said, it's also about dismantling, and we hope it is, dismantling some institutional systems that have been in place for a long time, policies or language, the way we communicate with students, with faculty or community. We also consider about how did those institutional systems validate the experience of students, the experiences that they bring with them, bring to our campuses? How do we change that whole institutional experience? It's, as you said, Bill, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. So what's the process your colleges have been using in respective to guided pathways? How have you been dismantling? And you spoke a little bit about that, but tell us a little bit more. Let's dig in deeper. What are some of the really examples of the things you want to celebrate or you are celebrating that you've taken to dismantle some of those?
So Guided Pathways has been an opportunity for us to look at the student experience and how college policies and practices impact. And there's just so many ways. So part of it is that students don't know our processes and don't have access to our processes. So we use data and then evaluating the impact and digging as to why. So we all have the situations where students will apply and then they'll get a registration appointment and then they'll sign up for a class and then they won't show up. Well, we kind of say, oh, well, that's just the way it is. The fact that populations of color are the ones who lose out in that system doesn't seem to bother people. So we talked to the students about we're sending you emails. And they said, well, that's my grandfather's way of communicating. What I need stuff on social media. I need to get text messages. And we looked at each other and said, oh God, can we do that? Is there privacy issues? What's the technology? So yes, so we solved all of that. And now we have ways of students getting text messages with embedded links to say your registration appointment, click here. Because the other thing they said is, we don't want to wait. We want it right now. And my generation is the maybe sometime generations. It's not the now generation. So they need immediate action, immediate feedback. We looked, for example, at students who weren't getting financial aid. And why? Okay, well, you know, they don't get financial aid. Okay, we gave them the chance. But no, when we looked at it, we saw, God, that FAFSA is crazy. How are they going to fill it out? So now we have a solution called ProVerify, which is an online FAFSA, which tells you exactly, you hover and it tells you where you get the information. You file it electronically, and it's connected to the IRS database that downloads the 1040, so the students don't have to, just no paper, they don't have to do anything about it. Mm-hmm. And our validation of Pell's through the top, you know, CARE Act was by Pell Grants. Of the 116 colleges in California, we got the most CARES Act because we have all the Pell Grants. Who knew? Who knew? And the second thing is why aren't they not completing the applications when we did this? So again, we talked to students and they said, well, I have this issue, you know, where my dad's in jail and my mother's in Hawaii and they have to sign it. And we said, well, how do we deal with all these individual situations? Well, college policy is you don't fill out the form, your problem. Now I have a manager and 2 staff that all they do is talk to students about what's your problem and how do we solve it. There's many more examples like this, but Guided Pathways causes us to look at those benchmark things that students aren't getting through and ask ourselves the tough questions, examine policy, and then dig deeper. Data and student conversations and then institutional solutions are the recipe for Guided Pathways. And the tough thing is we have so many of those, it's hard to prioritize which one to attack next, but we're working on it. And the solutions are not always easy to find. We've got a solution now for what's called early alert that the faculty seem to like. But I've got some problems with making it work. But I'm persistent to get that solution because that faculty feedback, it was the missing piece. A lot of our student support is kind of outside, but it doesn't involve faculty. If I can get faculty to work with students to identify their needs and then connect students to the need system that we built, this is a huge win. So Guided Pathways isn't something that, you know, you told me that this would take 5 years to work out. No, this is a forever process, Kay. There's no end to Guided Pathways. So we just keep, the pandemic came up, so we said, what do you need? Well, we need computers and we need Wi-Fi connections. So even before the CARES Act, we bought hundreds of laptops and gave them to students. They had to drive to the campus and the IT people were installing software. And we have something called MiFi that gives them the connection. And then if needed, there was a room where they could go with social distancing to be trained how to, because they don't even know how to use the computer. So you ask the students what they need and then you find a way to do it. And the resources will come, you can work it out. But this came from our Guided Pathway philosophy. You know, having computers isn't one of the barriers we had identified, but in the COVID environment, you have to use the Pathways strategy to look for those barriers, ask the students, and pursue aggressively the solutions.
So let's go ahead and move on to some questions, Q&A, because I know we've had a list. So I'm going to turn it over to Rob, Kay, and Priya.
Sure. Thank you so much, Bill and Michael, and thank you so much for facilitating the conversation, Linda, on what has been a robust conversation that I look forward to re-listening to after today. The first question from our participants is actually from our longtime friend and colleague, Sean Whalen from the College Futures Foundation. Sean asks, how do we avoid chasing the symptoms of structural racism? What kinds of processes will help us address structural racism in higher education at its roots. So Bill or Michael, feel free to kind of share your thoughts.
Once again, we're not just collecting data for data's sake. We really want to have data-informed decisions. And that means, you know, if you're going to use a framework, and guided pathways, I believe it worked for us in Rockland, and clearly Bill has talked about guided pathways and the work that he's done in his campus. You know, for us, it allows the questioning process to develop the data points so that you can then look at, in a critical way, the things that you have to address. And particularly as it comes to the equity piece, if you go to the guides and you go to the first sort of offering through the equity guides, you have a self-assessment that you can look at to try to create sort of a mapping process of how you're going to do some of this work at your institution that deals specifically with the structural racism issues that we find in higher ed and specifically in community colleges. So as we do our work at Rockland, we are taking an approach called Steps Beyond Statements. And one of the first things we're doing is we're going to use that specific instrument, that self-assessment, to begin the conversations that get us at those critical points where structural racism exists, because we have set up processes, we have designed structures, and because we set up structures and design structures within our institution, we actually have a lot of ability to dismantle, to recreate or create new structures in the place of those structures that actually produce the outcomes they currently produce. So, is it our responsibility as a sector to dismantle the whole of structural racism? Is it our responsibility to make sure that it is eradicated in the entire country? No. What our job is to create an environment where we can educate those citizens who will go forth and do the heavy lifting in every sphere of influence that we deploy them to. While we can't tell people what to think, we certainly can encourage them how to grow their thinking. We certainly can teach them the strategies that they can use in their specific context through the specific contribution they'll make in the world of work to transform all of the different aspects of the system. So in that way, we tangentially change the world.
I think there's a couple of ways to do it, and I think that it's basically a values system that is the challenge. If you aspire to a value system that is equity, you have to be able to challenge how you implement that value system in the processes you put in place. Take, for example, student discipline. Everybody will say, well, of course, you know, students misbehave, they should be disciplined. The second part, maybe that needs to be challenged, but what would be the alternative? We're working on an institutional value called restorative justice, and we've been working on this a while. It's a foundation for restorative justice, for racial justice, because a lot of it is the unfair penalty system that the society is built around. You need to question that value system. So for our student discipline, we are actually not imposing discipline through the process. We're evaluating the process and having the participants understand where the disagreement came from and restoring the relationship or the positive behavior, not through discipline, but through discovery. That concept of restorative justice, we're beginning with student discipline, but it's going to extend throughout the campus to have a broader view of what justice is. And this is a core value that I believe we can challenge. Can you change people's thinking? I think you can, because I see the thinking not being thinking, but being a lack of reaction rather than thought. If you believe in this, I talk to a lot of people of all walks of life, a lot of them believe in equity, believe in fair treatment, but they don't challenge the processes that they're using that they think is fair when you're presenting them with the evidence that it's not fair, and you have a viable alternative like restorative justice that better aligns with their values. I think you have a chance for more fundamental change.
Great, thank you so much to both of you. The next question I'm going to ask is a little bit of a mix between a comment from the chat as well as a question in the Q&A. So we've been talking a lot about leadership in a kind of a more traditional sense with both of you as presidents of your respective institutions. And there was a comment by Roger Stanford, who's the president of Western Technical College in Wisconsin, around kind of expanding that definition of leadership to talk about the role of leadership at multiple levels. And that kind of connects with a question from an anonymous attendee that I'm just going to read out loud. It says, one thing is to put these items within plans, policies, etc. However, I appreciate making these things concrete. How does a middle level manager from an underrepresented population at a predominantly white institution and community push for action without getting themselves in hot water? So perhaps each of you could talk a little bit about the role of the middle leader, whether titled, untitled, and this kind of broader definition of leadership when it comes to both educational equity and racial equity.
Well, first, let me say to the question relative to leadership, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, I believe, you don't need a title to be a leader. I think that better institutions, or institutions that actually adopt a distributive leadership model, are stronger institutions because the speed of trust is reduced, because people feel like what they have to say is valued. And while we may not all agree with approaches, we coalesce around approaches that actually produce the best outcomes, and then we measure those outcomes. So I feel that, if those who are watching that are at the head of the table, so to speak, I hope that you're employing strategies that promote distributed leadership, that you're using opportunities for folks at all levels to be heard in reasonable and meaningful ways, and that's tangibly translates into the ways in which you create opportunities for change in your institution. As a person of color who is at the mid-level management, I was a vice president for student affairs for many years. I didn't just start at the presidential level. And when you're in the vice president student affairs role, oftentimes you're in some institutions, not all, but in many institutions, you are not always as acknowledged or listened to as your academic counterparts. And yet, you really can't do the work of student success if you're only focusing on the academic agenda, because the people that have to actually do all of the specific details that allow for that agenda to be made more robust come from other areas of the college, whether it's student affairs, whether it's your business folks. There are a lot of people that are a part of the student success agenda. That being said, you have to be able to find the appropriate ways and utilizing your influence to work with the senior management to address the critical issues and tie them to the economic realities. The reason why I think I was fairly successful when I was a vice president is because I was best friends. I made good friends with the chief financial officer, and I was able to demonstrate how the actions in my specific functional area impact the economic destiny of the institution. I did fundraising through grant seeking. I was able to show that these amount of retention produces this amount of additional revenue to the institution, so that even if we don't have strong enrollment, if we increase our retention, here's the net effect of that. As a person who is a mid-level manager, you contribute to the economic destiny of your institution. You have to understand how you monetize that. You have to understand how you talk about that in terms of value, and then you parlay that information so that you can actually have a little bit more of a seat at the table in terms of moving the levels of power. Because money matters. particularly now we're going through an economic downturn, particularly now that budgets are getting tight. Every sort of entity within the institution has to be able to establish its own value proposition as we try to make the case for the whole value proposition. And so I would say to that person who's at the mid-level and you see these sort of things that are not right, you have to speak your mind, of course, but also use the economic sort of arguments, because particularly now they matter.
I think the mid-level influence issue applies to all middle managers, and perhaps even more to mid managers of color. I can speak to my own experience and what I've seen happen effectively. I spent many years without being in a senior management position. What I did was I volunteered. In our community colleges, if you volunteer, you get to shape some of the work. I remember one of the colleges I was at, there was a writing team for the faculty contract. So this was many years ago, and I volunteered to do that. And I said, well, why don't I review all those male gender pronouns in that document? Let me rewrite it for you so that it's not male specific anymore. They said, really, you can do that? Yes, I'll do that. So I took on that work and removed the gender bias in the faculty contract. Many years later, when I was a faculty leader, and we were looking for people to serve on the state Senate Executive Committee, I went out and sought people that I had met of underrepresented groups that I knew had the ability to speak, and I encouraged them to seek positions of leadership, and I helped expand the leadership training for the organization so that they could be effective in their work. Just putting someone of an underrepresented group into position isn't enough. They need training and they need support to make that happen, or they will be marginalized.
I mean, I've often been the only one at the table, and there is something to be said about that, because, you know, it is a balancing act. You know, this idea of sort of John Henryism, that, you know, John Henry is the sort of the worker that's going to outpace sort of the machine that bores the tunnel. And if he actually is able to get through the tunnel faster than the machine, he's going to save the jobs of all of his coworkers. And so he goes and he actually bores through the tunnel. And yeah, he beats the machine and dies of a heart attack. And so oftentimes that happens, particularly to leaders of color, that we are trying to do so much to actually be everything for everybody, because we believe that that's part of our expectation. And oftentimes we are not allowed into certain areas, quite frankly. And I'll use the word allowed because that's how it is, you know, unless you sort of, you know, kind of check off more boxes than anybody else. And so when I got into higher education, I knew if I wanted to go up, even though I had a terminal degree, I had to get another one. You know, when I came to apply for presidencies, I had to have so many different additional things and have seen sort of other colleagues that did not have to have as much and are, you know, in similar situations. My point is this, that your responsibility is also to do what is going to be appropriate for you. You have to also engage in the level of self-care, because at the end of the day, okay, so you're the first of this or that or whatever, and then you're dead, and the thing keeps going on anyway. So I just want us to be careful that, you know, in the conversations on your campus about sort of a race and ethnicity, and that then that doesn't mean, okay, you're the one black person on campus, so tell us how all black people in America feel, you know, because that happens to us. And sometimes we put ourselves in the way of it because we feel the weight of that responsibility. And sometimes our colleagues put us in that position. One of my faculty members said, you know, I'm very conscious when I teach my class, and particularly in the virtual environment, that I don't have a specific topic and just want to talk to certain students who happen to be from the ethnic group that I'm speaking about in this particular topic in this particular class, because that's not appropriate. And I think that all of us have to own the responsibility of defeating racism. Not just Black folks, not just white folks. Everybody has to own and ultimately own their learning. So like as a Black person, I don't have to educate all white people about white fragility. That's something you got to read, because I had to read about John Henryism and everything else. You know, you have to own your own responsibility of becoming educated. As institutions, we have to provide you a certain amount of understanding. We have to provide you a certain amount of resources. But, you know, when I wanted to be a college president, I had to learn every aspect of what it would mean for me to get in that position. So I think everybody has a responsibility, irrespective of race, class, or any ism, that you have to be able to do your work. Everybody has to do their own work.
I'm going to jump in, Michael, and ask you to also respond to this other question that's sort of a fill in the blank, something that you said a little while ago. Quote, everyone is comfortable with equity, but not everyone is comfortable with blank.
No, flip that. Everyone's comfortable with diversity. Not everyone is comfortable with equity.
Perfect.
Everyone is comfortable with diversity, because diversity makes us feel good. Well, we were all apart. Like, you know, everybody's music gets to be played at the dance. Like everybody's comfortable with diversity. But when you're talking about equity and you're talking about resources that may need to be reallocated to improve outcomes, they have to be reallocated from somewhere or something. And so once you start talking about equitable, you know, kind of reallocating resources to address gaps, that's when it's a problem. It's not a problem to say, hey, well, this month we're going to have this event and that month we're going to have that. People are very comfortable saying, let's go to learn something. You know, let's have the International Food Fest, and we can have a little table where everybody can have food of the world, and we can have everybody's culture, and let's have a little one of those little boards. And, you know, and then I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Don't cancel your International Food Fest because you listened to Dr. Baston on this presentation. Have your food fest, but understand that having a food fest is only one thing. That's great for inclusion. That does not have anything to do with equity.
So interesting to hear you say that, because I think about that in terms of all the things you want to do and the conversations you want to have, plus all the things you don't want to do and the conversations you don't want to have that are also extremely important. Bill, were you trying to get in as well? I wanted to make sure you had some time.
So Mount SAC is 87% people of color. So what we do to help all of that very wide experiences of students helps the college as a whole. So that's one of the things, there's so many things to do. One of the things I look for are things that not only raise the ability of each student to perform to their maximum ability, it does it in a way that produces additional resources, like the Pell Grants and the completion rates and overall guided pathways. When you do it right, it increases the resources. And it's like an investment in your future. It pays off. So I would say, you know, if there's a way to approach equity without, you know, verbiage, I don't particularly like verbiage. I look for outcomes and actions, and you don't have to call it equity for it to have an equitable result. If you approach what's good for the college and you have the priorities right, you will help the college as a whole as you help those who need that assistance. You know, it turns out actually that if you have an accepting environment of people of different backgrounds, it not only helps African Americans and Latinx, it helps everyone. It helps the first generation students, it helps the low income students, it helps the non-English speakers, it helps those who have different gender expression. It's changing the culture as a whole, like Michael was talking about. It's having a fundamental belief that's expressed in action of acceptance and support. And I think that way you can get away from those labels. The labels aren't helpful.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. And then the last question we have kind of resonates with something you just said a few minutes ago, Michael, around how it is everybody's role and responsibility to play a part in this. Christy Wellington Baker talks a little bit about Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility. And she asks, how do each of you find ways to encourage, support, and build capacity among your leadership team to examine their own white fragility and those of their peers?
Wonderful question. I mean, at our college, we have a chief diversity officer who is actually going to be developing our virtual equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion center. It's going to be a virtual center, which will have lots of sort of good bits of information, trainings, all resources for everyone on the campus so that they can start to do their own work, their personal work around trying to become more interculturally competent and to become more aware of ways that you can get involved at the level of your comfort. We're not expecting, I'm not certainly expecting everybody to be with the sign, marching down the town square, you know, chanting, "We shall overcome." That's not my expectation of everybody. If that's what you want to do, hey, power to the people. My point is that whatever your individual work is that you need to do, whether you're white, whether you're Black, whether you're Latinx, it doesn't matter. You have to do your own work in this area. And that's something that I think is very important. We as an institution, we ought to give you access to the resources, the information, the supports. We ought to have a space where you can get as much information as you need and that you can also contribute, you know, sort of like a Linden library, if you will, but as you in the community find important resources that everyone's awareness should be heightened to, that there would be a way to kind of like put that into this space for our community. I think it's very, very important that people have the opportunity to get resources from their institution, but they have the obligation to do the work that they need to do for themselves. So you can't expect that your institution is going to make you this or that. You have to expect that if you do the work, you will ultimately be able to see some of the outcomes from that work. And that's why I recommend all of these guides. These guides are really, really wonderful sort of letters of love and concern to the community, and that they should be embraced in that way. Now, some of them may offend people, hurt their feelings. Some of them went too far from your perspective or didn't go far enough from your perspective. It really doesn't matter. What it is that these are the perspectives of these important leaders who have really thought about these issues for a long time. And I think that, you know, opportunities like this, here's a way for you to lean in at a level of your comfort and preparation.
I think fragility is an important topic here, because to be able to take some risks in a position of fragility is a real challenge. A couple of things that have been part of my own transition as a leader is to touch into my areas of fragility and be open about it. Let me give you a couple of examples. I give video updates to the college during this period, and at the end of one of them, I talked about kind of a personal message to say, you know, I miss you people. I miss being with you on campus. My passion comes from being with you and gaining the energy from you. I'm at home, and I'm even afraid to walk out my own door about the risks that's out there. And I miss being with you to get that strength to move on. The second thing I did was, when we were doing some of the emphasis on first generation college students, I'm a first generation college student. So I did a video talking about my own experiences of not having a family who knew anything about college, never went to college, and being an only child, being in UCLA, and how I was really fragile about that. And I flunked out of UCLA at the end of my second year. And I tell them it's the first time I ever went to see a counselor because I thought I could do it. I had to admit my own frailty and get help. And I wanted to have that be a personal message to say, it's okay to have those frailties. It's what you do about it. And you ask for help. We're all together in this. That helps a lot.
I think this brings us to the close of our conversation for today, and clearly it is not over and must continue. I want to express deep gratitude to Michael Bastin, Bill Scroggins, and to Linda Garcia for her masterful moderation of this conversation, and to NCII for sponsoring it. We each individually and all collectively have both professional and moral responsibility to address these issues of equity and social justice, to become anti-racist in our roles, whatever those roles are, at whatever level of our institution or organizations. And it cannot and must not be a superficial endeavor. I so appreciated the question from Sean Whalen about getting beyond the symptoms and to the root causes. That's a whole other webinar. We simply have to be willing to examine the historical structures, the traditions, the policies of higher education and of community colleges that perpetuate racism and economic disparity, even as our rhetoric suggests that we want to eradicate it. Certainly there is good work in progress, as we have seen and heard today, but in too many respects, we have only just begun. So we hope to see all of you with us as together we find the better path forward. Thank you so much for being with us, and good afternoon.